There are moments when the universe reaches down and touches a life, setting it on a trajectory that will ripple forward through decades. October 9th, 1968. A Wednesday afternoon in the Bronx. A 9-year-old boy named Neil deGrasse Tyson walked through the doors of the Hayden Planetarium, and everything changed. Not gradually, not subtly, but with the force of a revelation that would burn inside him for the rest of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The planetarium sky theatre sat in darkness. Around young Neil, visitors settled into their seats, their conversations fading to whispers. Then the lights dimmed completely, and the projector at the center of the room awakened. Stars appeared overhead, not the handful visible through the Bronx's light-polluted sky, but thousands of them. The Milky Way stretched across the dome like a river of light. Constellations emerged with a clarity that New York City had stolen from its residents decades ago. Neil sat transfixed. His mother, Sunchita, watched her son's face tilted upward, illuminated by the artificial cosmos above them. She didn't understand what she was seeing, couldn't name the stars or explain the nebulae, but she recognized something profound happening to her child. The universe was claiming him, or perhaps he was claiming it. Consider for a moment what that means. A boy growing up in the Riverdale section of the Bronx, where the night sky offered only the brightest stars fighting through the haze of 8 million people's lights, suddenly confronted with the full majesty of the cosmos. It wasn't just beautiful, it was impossible to ignore. The universe doesn't ask permission to inspire, it simply reveals itself, and some minds catch fire. Neil left the planetarium that day transformed. Walking back through the city, streets, he kept looking up, searching for what he'd just witnessed. The stars were there, hidden behind the glow, waiting. He knew they were waiting specifically for him. His mother noticed the change immediately. Within weeks, Neil was checking out every astronomy book the library contained. He filled notebooks with drawings of planets, calculations of distances he barely understood, questions that multiplied faster than answers. Sunchita didn't know anything about astronomy herself. She was a gerontologist, trained to understand the aging of human bodies, not the life cycles of stars. But she recognized passion when she saw it, and she made a decision that would prove crucial. She would support this obsession, even if she couldn't share it. She saved money, not the spare change kind of saving, but the real sacrifice kind that means saying no to other things the family might have wanted. By the time Neil turned 12, she had enough to buy him something extraordinary, his own telescope. Imagine unwrapping that gift. A Criterion RV6 Newtonian reflector, 60 millimeters in diameter. To most 12-year-olds in 1971, it would have been a curious tube with lenses. To Neil, it was a portal. The first time he turned it toward the moon and saw craters in sharp relief, mountains casting shadows across ancient plains, he understood something fundamental. The universe wasn't just something to read about in books. It was real, tangible, accessible. You could reach out and touch it with light and glass. But there was a problem. The Bronx in the early 1970s wasn't a place where a young black boy could walk around at night carrying what looked like a weapon without drawing attention. The telescope's tube, slung over his shoulder as he walked to darker observation spots, made people nervous, made them suspicious. More than once, police stopped him, asking what he was carrying, where he was going, whether he belonged in this neighborhood. This is where the story becomes more complex, more painful, because Neil wasn't just battling light pollution, he was battling assumptions about who gets to study the stars, who belongs in science, who has the right to claim the universe as their own. His father, Cyril, watched these incidents with growing concern. Cyril was a sociologist, a man who understood structural inequality not just theoretically but viscerally. He'd lived through Jim Crow, navigated white institutions, built a career by being twice as good to get half as far. When he looked at his son with a telescope, he saw both pride and danger. Pride that Neil had found something to love. Danger that this love would mark him as different, make him vulnerable, expose him to a world not ready to accept a black astrophysicist. The relationship between father and son grew complicated around this tension. Cyril never forbade the astronomy. He was too thoughtful for that, too aware of the importance of passion, but he worried openly. Questioned whether Neil was preparing himself for the inevitable disappointments ahead. Asked whether there were more practical paths, safer dreams. Neil heard these concerns, absorbed them, and kept observing. Night after night, he'd carry the telescope up 5 flights of stairs, set it up among the tar paper and old vents, and turn toward the heavens. The Bronx fell away below him, up there, above the streets where he had to explain himself, above the assumptions and questions. He was just an observer. The universe didn't care about his skin color. Stars don't discriminate. They shine for anyone who takes the time to look. Jupiter revealed its moons, just as Galileo had seen them 400 years earlier. Saturn's rings emerged, impossibly thin, impossibly perfect. The Orion Nebula showed hints of its turbulent clouds where new stars were being born. Each observation was a conquest, a small claim of territory in a domain others suggested wasn't meant for him. At school, Neil existed between worlds. He attended Riverdale Kingsbridge Academy, a school that didn't quite know what to make of him. He excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and science, finishing problems while other students were still reading the questions. But he also joined the wrestling team, a decision that confused some observers. How does an intellectual end up grappling on mats, learning holds and escapes, pushing his body to exhaustion? Neil understood something his critics didn't. Wrestling taught discipline that books alone couldn't provide. On the mat, you couldn't theorize your way to victory. You had to execute, had to persist through discomfort, through opponents stronger or more experienced, through moments when your body screamed to quit. Those lessons translated directly to science, where breakthrough often comes from persistence rather than pure inspiration. His teammates called him the wrestler who studies stars. It was meant as friendly teasing, but it captured a truth about his life. He was always hyphenated, always explaining himself, always proving that interests could coexist, even when they seemed contradictory to others. The nights on the roof continued. Neil developed systematic observation habits, recording what he saw, tracking planetary positions, comparing his observations to published data. He wasn't just looking anymore. He was doing science, even if he didn't fully realize it yet, making hypotheses, testing them, accepting what the data revealed, rather than what he wanted to see. His mother continued her quiet support. She didn't understand what he was writing in those notebooks, couldn't follow the calculations covering page after page, but she noticed when supplies ran low and replaced them. She defended his roof access to skeptical neighbors who wondered what the boy was doing up there night after night. She created space in their small apartment for his growing library of astronomy books, even when space was precious. Sunchita understood something profound. You don't have to understand someone's passion to support it. You just have to believe in the person. She believed in Neil with a fierceness that sustained him through doubts. Because there were doubts, late at night, alone on the roof with the telescope, Neil sometimes wondered whether his father was right. The astronomy world he read about in magazines and books was overwhelmingly white. The famous astronomers, the ones making discoveries and writing papers, didn't look like him. Maybe this was a dream meant for someone else. Maybe he was pursuing something beautiful but ultimately closed to him. Then he'd turn the telescope toward a new target, and the doubt would evaporate. The Andromeda Galaxy appeared in his eyepiece, a smudge of light representing 2 trillion stars 2.5 million light-years away. How could something that magnificent be off-limits to anyone? The universe predated human prejudices by billions of years. It had no opinion about who should study it. It simply existed, indifferent and available. By the time Neil reached high school, his reputation preceded him. The kid with the telescope, the one who could explain why the moon went through phases, why Mars appeared red, why you couldn't see the Milky Way from city lights. Teachers started calling on him during science classes, knowing he'd not only have the answer, but could explain it in ways other students understood. He applied to the Bronx High School of Science, one of New York City's specialized schools that admitted students based solely on a test score. No interviews where implicit bias could creep in. No essays where assumptions about background could cloud judgment. Just a test, and your score either opened the door or didn't. Neil's score opened the door. Walking into Bronx Science for the first time, he joined a school of 3,000. Students where fewer than a dozen were black. The numbers told a story, not about talent or interest, but about opportunity, about preparation, about systems that funneled different communities toward different futures. He noticed the looks, the surprise when he answered questions correctly in advanced physics, the assumption that he must be an athlete first, student second, the unspoken question in some teachers' eyes, "How did you get in here?" Neil answered those questions the way he'd learned on the wrestling mat, through performance. He excelled in physics, understanding wave mechanics and thermodynamics, with an intuition that suggested natural talent rather than just hard work. He continued wrestling, making varsity his junior year, proving you could excel physically and intellectually simultaneously. But the nights belonged to the stars. The telescope came with him on camping trips, turned towards skies darker than anything the Bronx offered. He joined the astronomy club, a small group of similarly obsessed students who gathered to share observations, debate theories, plan trips to planetariums and observatories. They accepted him completely. In the astronomy club, what mattered was what you knew, what you'd observed, how well you understood the mechanics of celestial motion. One of his clubmates was another student who'd also fallen in love with the cosmos as a child. They'd spend hours discussing the latest discoveries, debating whether black holes could really exist, imagining what it would be like to study astronomy professionally. The dream was taking shape. Not just watching stars, but understanding them. Not just reading about discoveries, but making them. Neil began to see a path forward, narrow and uncertain, but visible. He could become an astrophysicist, could spend his life studying the universe professionally, could claim that territory he'd been mapping from his Bronx rooftop. His mother encouraged him. His father remained cautiously supportive, proud of Neil's academic success, even while worried about the obstacles ahead. His teachers at Bronx Science began writing recommendation letters describing a student who combined genuine talent with relentless work ethic, someone who might actually succeed in the competitive world of professional astronomy. Senior year arrived, and with it, college applications. Neil applied to the best programs in the country: Harvard, Princeton, Cornell, MIT, schools that produced the astronomers he'd been reading about for years, schools where, statistically, almost no black students studied astrophysics. The acceptance letter from Harvard arrived in spring, full admission to the class of 1980, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, opening its doors to a kid from the Bronx who'd taught himself astronomy on a rooftop with a 60mm telescope. Neil's mother cried when she read the letter. Tears of pride, yes, but also tears of vindication. Every dollar saved for that telescope, every time she'd defended his roof access, every moment she'd believed in this strange passion she didn't fully understand, all of it had been worth it. His father allowed himself a smile. Perhaps the dream wasn't as impossible as he'd feared. Perhaps the world was changing, slowly, enough to make space for a black astrophysicist. Neil himself felt something more complex. Excitement, certainly, pride in the achievement, but also trepidation. He'd proven himself in the Bronx, in a high school where he was one of the few. Now he was heading to an institution where he might be the only one, where the assumptions and questions would intensify, where he'd have to prove himself all over again to people even more skeptical. But he'd been training for this his entire life, on the wrestling mat, learning to persist through exhaustion, on the roof, teaching himself patience as clouds rolled in night after night, in classrooms, growing accustomed to being underestimated and exceeding expectations anyway. The universe had claimed him that October day in 1968. 10 years later, he was ready to claim it back, ready to walk into rooms where people who looked like him weren't supposed to be, ready to study stars, not despite the obstacles, but carrying them as proof of how badly he wanted this. The telescope that had started it all still sat in his room, now accompanied by more advanced equipment, notebooks filled with observations, star charts marked with his own annotations. Looking at it, Neil remembered being 9 years old in a darkened planetarium, feeling the universe reach down and touch his life. The universe hadn't let go, and neither would he. Harvard University in September of 1980 presented itself as everything Neil had imagined and nothing he'd hoped for. The brick buildings spoke of 3 centuries of scholarship. The libraries held millions of volumes. The physics department boasted Nobel laureates who walked the same halls as undergraduates. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it was suffocating. The problems began immediately, though they wore the mask of helpfulness. An academic advisor, looking over Neil's intended concentration in physics, suggested he might want to consider something more suitable to his background. Not explicitly racist, you understand. Just helpful. Just realistic. Just preparing this young man from the Bronx for the inevitable disappointment of trying to compete in a field that required, well, a certain kind of preparation that perhaps he hadn't received. Neil heard what wasn't being said. He'd been hearing it his entire life, had learned to translate the coded language of low expectations. He smiled politely, thanked the advisor for his concern, and registered for the most challenging physics courses available. The campus itself felt hostile in ways both obvious and subtle. Walking across Harvard Yard at night, campus police stopped him regularly. Where was he going? Did he have his student ID? Was he sure he was supposed to be there? White students walked past unchallenged while Neil pulled out his identification for the 3rd time that week, proving his right to exist in spaces his tuition paid for just as much as anyone else's. In physics lectures, he sat among hundreds of students, and he could count the other black faces without running out of fingers. The isolation wasn't just numerical, it was atmospheric. Study groups formed organically among students who recognized each other from prep schools, from summer programs, from networks Neil had never known existed. He'd excelled at Bronx science, but many of his Harvard classmates had attended elite private schools with resources beyond anything public education offered. They spoke a language of assumed opportunity, of summers spent in laboratories, of family friends who were professors, of futures mapped out before they'd taken their first college exam. Neil watched them and understood. Talent wasn't the dividing line here. Preparation was, connection was, the invisible architecture of advantage that accumulates across generations. He threw himself into coursework, determined to overcome through sheer effort. Classical mechanics, electricity, And magnetism, quantum physics, he absorbed it all, spending hours in problem sets that required not just understanding but creative application. His grades were solid, often excellent. By objective measures, he was succeeding. But success felt hollow when achieved in isolation. The wrestling team provided some community. On the mat, physics calculations didn't matter. What mattered was technique, conditioning, will. He continued competing, captain of the team by sophomore year, finding in physical exhaustion a temporary escape from the mental exhaustion of constantly proving his right to occupy space. His teammates respected him, but they didn't share his passion for astrophysics, didn't understand why he'd spend clear nights outside with binoculars instead of at parties. The physics students didn't understand why he'd waste time wrestling when he could be studying. Neil existed between communities, fully embraced by neither. The professors were the deepest disappointment. Not all of them, to be fair. Some evaluated work without prejudice, responded to questions with genuine engagement, treated students as individuals rather than representatives of categories. But others carried assumptions as heavy as textbooks. When Neil asked sophisticated questions in class, some professors seemed surprised, as if intelligence from a black student required explanation. When he struggled with a concept, as every student does, certain faculty members nodded knowingly, as if confirming suspicions about whether he truly belonged. One professor suggested, after Neil performed poorly on a midterm, that perhaps he should reconsider whether astrophysics was really the right path. Never mind that half the class had performed equally poorly. Never mind that Neil had excelled on previous exams. The professor's concern was specific, directed, revealing. These moments accumulated like small cuts, none fatal individually but collectively draining. Neil found himself questioning whether his father had been right all along, whether this dream was meant for someone else, whether the universe that had seemed so welcoming from his Bronx rooftop belonged to people who looked different, came from different places, carried different histories. The lowest point arrived during junior year. Neil sat in his dormitory room, surrounded by physics texts and problem sets, and seriously considered abandoning astrophysics entirely. Not dropping out, he was too stubborn for that, but switching to something easier, something where he wouldn't have to battle both the material and the assumptions, something where his presence wouldn't require constant justification. He called his mother, didn't explain everything, couldn't put into words the accumulation of small defeats, just said he was thinking about changing directions. Sunchita listened. Then she asked a simple question. "Do you still love the stars?" Neil looked out his window at the Cambridge night sky, hazy with light pollution but still showing the brightest stars. "Yes," he admitted. "Then don't let anyone take that from you," she said. It wasn't a complicated pep talk, no grand philosophy about overcoming obstacles or proving doubters wrong. Just a reminder, he'd loved this first, before anyone else had an opinion about whether he should. That love belonged to him, but love alone wasn't sufficient. Neil needed something Harvard wasn't providing: mentorship, community, the sense that someone believed in his potential rather than questioning it. He began researching other programs, looking for environments that might be more welcoming. The University of Texas at Austin appeared as an unexpected possibility. Strong astronomy program, excellent faculty, and something crucial, a reputation for judging work rather than background. Neil applied for transfer, not announcing his decision widely, unsure whether he was making a strategic choice or admitting defeat. The acceptance arrived with a note from Professor Gerard de Vaucouleurs, one of the world's leading authorities on galaxies. The note was brief but transformative. "I've reviewed your transcript and recommendations. I look forward to working with someone of your obvious ability." Read that again. Not someone with your background who shows promise. Not someone we're taking a chance on. someone of your obvious ability, as if talent were the only relevant factor, as if everything else were irrelevant noise. Neil arrived in Austin in January of 1983, carrying both relief and residual anger. Relief at escaping Harvard's suffocating atmosphere. Anger that escape had been necessary, that he'd had to abandon a prestigious institution because it couldn't see past his skin color to his capability. Texas was different from the first day. Not perfect, no place is perfect, but different in ways that mattered. Professor de Vaucouleurs treated Neil as he treated all his students, as potential colleagues whose ideas deserved serious engagement. When Neil proposed research directions, de Vaucouleurs evaluated them on scientific merit. When Neil struggled with mathematical techniques, de Vaucouleurs taught him without questioning whether he was capable of learning. This might sound unremarkable. This is how mentorship should work. But for Neil, after 2.5 years at Harvard, it was revolutionary. De Vaucouleurs was a French astronomer who'd escaped Nazi-occupied Europe, spent years mapping galaxies from observatories across the world, and understood deeply that scientific truth transcends all artificial barriers. He'd published the Reference Catalogue of Bright Galaxies, a comprehensive compilation that became essential to astronomers globally. He'd measured galaxy distances, studied their structures, contributed fundamental knowledge to understanding the universe's large-scale organization. And now he was sharing that knowledge with Neil, not as charity but as investment in the next generation of astronomers. The research focused on galactic structures, particularly understanding how galaxies form and evolve. Neil learned to analyze photometric data, to build mathematical models of stellar distributions, to test hypotheses against observations. The work required mastery of complex statistical techniques, computer programming, and theoretical physics. It was challenging in ways that had nothing to do with belonging and everything to do with pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. Other faculty members followed de Vaucouleurs' lead. They saw a capable student eager to learn and offered guidance accordingly. The astronomy department had other black students, not many, but more than one. Neil wasn't a curiosity or an experiment. He was a graduate student doing the work. The wrestling continued too. Texas had a club team, less competitive than Harvard's varsity program, but still providing the physical outlet Neil needed. His teammates there didn't care about his academic field. They cared whether he showed up to practice, whether he pushed himself, whether he supported others on the team. That uncomplicated camaraderie was nourishing in ways Neil hadn't fully appreciated until he'd experienced its absence. Austin's night sky offered more stars than Cambridge had shown. Neil bought a better telescope, spending evenings at the university observatory, turning serious observation from childhood hobby to professional training. He learned to use the research-grade instruments, to plan observation runs, to reduce data from photographic plates into quantitative measurements. The transformation wasn't instant. Neil still carried the Harvard wounds, still caught himself waiting for professors to question his presence. But slowly, the defensive crouch relaxed. He began contributing to department seminars, offering ideas, debating interpretations. His contributions were evaluated on merit, and they held up. Professor de Vaucouleurs became more than an advisor. He became an advocate, someone who saw Neil's complete potential and worked to develop it. When Neil proposed ambitious research directions, de Vaucouleurs helped refine them rather than discouraging them. When Neil published his first paper, de Vaucouleurs celebrated it as the beginning of a career, not the limit of possibility. Consider what this means in the broader context. Neil had arrived at Harvard with genuine talent, strong preparation, and passionate commitment. Harvard had nearly extinguished that passion through isolation and low expectations. Texas, with no more resources and arguably less prestige, nurtured the same student into flowering. The difference wasn't the student. The difference was the environment, the mentorship, the fundamental belief that talent comes in all colors and deserves cultivation regardless of packaging. Other students noticed Neil's transformation. He became more confident in seminars, more willing to challenge established interpretations, more himself. The defensive armor he'd worn at Harvard became unnecessary. He could focus energy on science rather than constantly proving his right to do science. The research progressed. Neil's senior thesis examined the photometric properties of galaxies, analyzing how light distributes across different galaxy types. The work contributed genuinely new understanding to the field. Not groundbreaking, but solid, professional, the kind of research that builds scientific knowledge brick by brick. Professor de Vaucouleurs wrote recommendation letters for Neil's graduate school applications that focused entirely on scientific achievement and potential. No hedging, no coded language, no subtle undermining, just straightforward assessment. This student has the talent and training to succeed at the highest levels of astrophysics. Neil applied to top doctoral programs: Princeton, Caltech, Chicago, Berkeley, places that produced the leaders in astrophysics, where the next generation of discoveries would be made. After the Harvard experience, he approached these applications with trepidation. But he also had something he'd lacked before: proof that when evaluated fairly, he could excel. The acceptance from Princeton arrived in spring of 1985. The graduate program in astrophysical sciences, one of the most competitive in the world, offering full funding and the opportunity to work with some of the field's most distinguished researchers. Neil held the letter and remembered sitting in his Harvard dormitory room, contemplating abandonment. How close he'd come to giving up. How easy it would have been to accept the message that this wasn't meant for him. But he'd found Gerard de Vaucouleurs, or perhaps de Vaucouleurs had found him, and that single relationship had changed everything. One mentor who saw ability instead of difference, who invested in potential instead of questioning it, who demonstrated through action that science truly can transcend artificial barriers. Years later, Neil would say that de Vaucouleurs saved his career. That's not hyperbole. It's simple fact. Without that mentorship, without that environment where he could develop without constantly defending his presence, Neil's story might have ended very differently. Another talented young person, driven from science by an inability to see past superficial differences. But the story didn't end. It was only beginning. Neil packed his belongings, said goodbye to the Texas Observatory where he'd spent countless nights, and prepared for Princeton. He was older now, more experienced, carrying both scars and strength. He knew what hostile environments looked like. He knew what supportive ones felt like, and he was determined to succeed not despite the obstacles, but as testimony to everyone who'd been denied similar opportunities. The universe that had claimed him in a Bronx planetarium still held him, and now he had the training, the confidence, and the support to pursue it at the highest levels. Princeton awaited, with new challenges and new discoveries ahead. But first, he returned to the Bronx for a brief visit, walked through the old neighborhood, past his high school, past the apartment building where he'd spent so many nights on the roof with his first telescope. The stars were still barely visible through the light pollution, but he knew they were there, had always been there, waiting. A group of neighborhood kids recognized him, asked what he was doing now. When he told them he was going to Princeton to study astrophysics, to become a scientist who studies the universe, one of them looked skeptical. "People like us can do that," Neil smiled. "Watch me." Princeton University's astrophysics department occupied Peyton Hall, a building that had witnessed some of the 20th century's most important cosmological discoveries. Einstein had walked these halls. Schwarzschild had calculated the geometry of black holes here. Spitzer had pioneered space telescope concepts. The walls held history, and now Neil deGrasse Tyson had arrived to add his own chapter. He was one of 7 black students pursuing doctoral degrees in astrophysics across the entire United States that year. 7. In a country of 240 million people, the number itself tells a story about barriers, about how many talented minds never get the chance, about systems that filter people out long before they reach graduate school. Neil felt the weight of that statistic, not just personal pressure to succeed, but representative burden. When he struggled with a concept, he couldn't just be a student having difficulty. He risked confirming stereotypes about whether people who looked like him belonged in theoretical astrophysics. When he excelled, he couldn't just be a talented individual. He became evidence in ongoing debates about affirmative action and merit. This is exhausting in ways difficult to explain to those who've never experienced it. Imagine studying quantum mechanics while simultaneously aware that your performance will be used to judge an entire race's capability. Imagine every mistake magnified, every success questioned. The research began immediately. Princeton's program didn't ease students into doctoral work. You arrived ready to contribute, ready to push boundaries, ready to compete with the brightest minds globally. Neil's focus turned to the structure of galactic bulges, the dense central regions of spiral galaxies where stars pack together in complex patterns. The question driving his research was fundamental. How did these structures form? Did bulges build up gradually through continuous star formation? Or did they form catastrophically through galaxy mergers? The answer held implications for understanding how galaxies evolved across cosmic time, how the universe's structure emerged from the smooth early conditions the Big Bang created. To answer these questions required sophisticated mathematical modeling. Neil constructed simulations that recreated galaxy formation, adjusting variables, testing different scenarios, comparing predictions to observations. The work demanded mastery of complex computational techniques that few astronomers possessed at the time. Personal computers were still primitive. The heavy computing happened on university mainframes, requiring programs written in Fortran, submitted as batch jobs, results returned hours or days later. Neil spent countless hours debugging code, refining models, analyzing output. The work was solitary in nature, just him and mathematics and physics, testing whether his understanding of galaxy formation matched what telescopes revealed. When simulations failed to match observations, he'd adjust assumptions, try different approaches, persist through frustration. Professor John Wheeler supervised his work. Wheeler was a giant in theoretical physics, having coined the term black hole, having worked on nuclear fission during World War II, having mentored dozens of students who went on to distinguished careers. He was also 74 years old, approaching the end of his active research career, and he saw in Neil someone worth investing his remaining energy. Wheeler's mentorship style was Socratic. He asked questions rather than providing answers, forcing Neil to think deeply about assumptions, to question conventional wisdom, to defend conclusions rigorously. Their weekly meetings stretched for hours, blackboards filling with equations, debates ranging across physics and philosophy. But Wheeler provided something beyond intellectual guidance. He was an ally in the truest sense. When faculty members questioned whether Neil's admission represented affirmative action rather than merit, Wheeler shut down those conversations decisively. When some suggested Neil's research topics were too easy or too narrow, Wheeler defended the work's genuine difficulty and significance. One particular incident crystallized Wheeler's support. During a department colloquium, Neil presented preliminary results from his bulge research. The mathematics was complex, the computational techniques sophisticated. After his talk, a faculty member asked whether Neil had really done the analysis himself or had received substantial help from more experienced researchers. The implication was clear. The question wouldn't have been asked of a white student presenting similar work. It assumed incompetence, assumed that achievement must have external explanation. Wheeler stood up immediately. His voice carried authority accumulated over 50 years in physics. "I've reviewed every line of, quote, this analysis. The work is entirely Dr. Tyson's own. The techniques required are advanced, yes. That's why we admitted him, because he's capable of advanced work. Are there other questions about the actual science?" The room fell silent. The message was unmistakable. Questioning Neil's capability was unacceptable, and Wheeler would use his considerable influence to protect his student. Neil never forgot that moment. The relief of having someone stand up, publicly and unequivocally. The validation that his work was his own, that his achievements were genuine. Wheeler didn't just mentor Neil's research. He modeled what advocacy looks like, how allies use privilege to create space for those who face constant questioning. The research itself proved groundbreaking. Neil's analysis demonstrated that galactic bulges evolved through multiple pathways, not a single formation mechanism. Some formed through disk instabilities, others through merger events, still others through continuous accretion. The universe, as usual, turned out more complex than simplified models suggested. His work required analyzing photometric data from multiple galaxy surveys, building statistical models to separate different formation histories, connecting observations to theoretical predictions. The dissertation that emerged represented genuine contribution to astrophysics, the kind of work that gets cited by other researchers, that advances collective understanding incrementally but meaningfully. But Neil also pursued another research interest during his Princeton years: dwarf galaxies. These small systems, containing millions rather than billions of stars, exhibited unusual properties that challenged conventional understanding. Their mass distributions didn't match predictions. Their star formation histories seemed abnormal. Something about dwarf galaxies refused to fit standard models. Neil became fascinated by these outliers, these systems that broke rules. Perhaps because he understood what it felt like to be an outlier himself, to exist outside expected patterns. His work on dwarf galaxies explored whether these systems represented failed galaxy formation or simply different evolutionary pathways. The research required accessing telescope time at major observatories, traveling to remote mountaintops where darkness allowed the faint light from distant dwarf galaxies to be captured. Neil learned the patient art of observational astronomy. Planning observation runs months in advance, hoping for clear weather, dealing with equipment failures, extracting signal from noise in data that pushed technological limits. Faculty members sometimes suggested Neil was spreading himself too thin, pursuing multiple research directions when focusing on one would be more prudent. But Neil understood something important. The universe is interconnected. Understanding galactic bulges requires understanding how galaxies form generally. Understanding dwarf galaxies illuminates processes operating in larger systems. Everything connects if you look carefully enough. He published papers, presented at conferences, built reputation. Other astronomers began citing his work, inviting him to give talks, recognizing his contributions. The Princeton degree would open doors, certainly, but the research itself, the genuine scientific achievement, mattered more. The doctoral years weren't only struggle and triumph. There were friendships formed with fellow graduate students who shared the peculiar isolation of doctoral research. Late-night conversations about physics and philosophy, about whether black holes destroy information, about what existed before the Big Bang, about whether we're alone in the universe. There was continued wrestling too, though club level rather than varsity. The physical outlet remained important, a way to exhaust the body when the mind spun too fast, when anxiety about research progress or job prospects made sleep elusive, and, There were moments of pure wonder that reminded Neil why he'd chosen this path. Nights at the observatory when everything aligned, clear skies, functioning equipment, a galaxy revealing its secrets in captured photons. Those moments when years of preparation and hours of work condensed into data that answered questions, that showed the universe behaving exactly as mathematics predicted, or surprisingly different, both outcomes equally thrilling. The dissertation defense arrived in 1991. Neil stood before his committee and presented 6 years of work condensed into a 100-page document and a 1-hour presentation. He explained his models, defended his methods, answered questions that probed every assumption and conclusion. The committee deliberated briefly and returned with the verdict. Neil deGrasse Tyson, Ph.D., in astrophysics from Princeton University. One of only a handful of Black Americans to earn that degree, Neil called his mother first. Sunchita cried again, as she had when the Harvard acceptance arrived, as she had when he'd bought that first telescope with her saved money. All those years of support, of believing when others doubted, of defending her son's right to pursue impossible dreams vindicated. His father's pride was quieter, but equally profound. Cyril had worried about the path Neil chose, about the obstacles waiting. But his son had navigated them, had earned the highest degree in one of science's most demanding fields. The worry didn't disappear. Cyril understood that a doctorate didn't erase discrimination, but it transformed into something closer to hope. Professor Wheeler hosted a small celebration in Peyton Hall. Other faculty members attended, offering congratulations. Some had doubted along the way, had questioned whether Neil truly belonged. But the work spoke for itself. The dissertation made contributions that couldn't be dismissed or attributed to anything except talent and effort. Neil thought about those 7 Black astrophysics doctoral students across the entire country. How many others might have joined them if barriers were lowered? How much knowledge remained undiscovered because minds that could make breakthroughs never got the chance? The job market loomed next. A doctorate opened doors to postdoctoral positions, to research fellowships, eventually to faculty positions at universities. But Neil was thinking about something else, an opportunity he'd heard about almost accidentally. The Hayden Planetarium, that place where everything started on October 9th, 1968, was planning renovations, major renovations, a complete rebuild that would transform it from aging relic to cutting-edge facility. They'd need new leadership, someone who understood both classical astronomy and modern astrophysics, someone who could make the cosmos accessible to millions. Neil didn't apply immediately, wasn't sure whether it was the right move. Research scientists generally pursued postdocs at prestigious institutions, built publication records, established themselves before considering positions at public institutions. The traditional path had clear markers, understood progression, but traditional paths hadn't always welcomed people who looked like Neil. And he remembered being 9 years old in that planetarium, feeling the universe claim him. What if he could create that moment for other children? What if he could be the person at the planetarium who showed kids from the Bronx, from Harlem, from anywhere, that the cosmos belonged to them too? The decision crystallized slowly. Neil would apply, knowing it was unconventional, knowing some faculty might view it as abandoning serious research. But he'd spent too many years proving himself to people who questioned whether he belonged. Maybe it was time to build something new instead, to create spaces where belonging wasn't questioned. He submitted his application to the EXET, Hayden Planetarium position. The letter began simply, 23 years ago, you changed my life. I'd like to help you change other lives. The universe had claimed him in that building. Perhaps it was time to return the favor, to help the planetarium claim a new generation of dreamers who needed to see that the stars shine for everyone, that the cosmos welcomes all who take time to look up. Princeton was ending. But the story was far from over. Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, carrying both his doctorate and his childhood wonder, was about to return to where it all began. The Hayden Planetarium offered Neil the position in 1996. At 37 years old, he became the youngest director in the institution's history. The building where his passion had ignited 28 years earlier now fell under his stewardship, along with a daunting responsibility: oversee a complete reconstruction budgeted at $100 million. $100 million. Consider that number. More money than most people encounter in lifetimes, entrusted to a young astrophysicist whose primary experience involved mathematical models and telescope observations, not construction management and budget oversight. The American Museum of Natural History's leadership took a considerable risk on Neil, betting that scientific vision mattered more than administrative experience. They were right, though the path ahead would prove turbulent. Neil walked through the old planetarium during his first week, absorbing its faded grandeur. The Sky Theatre, where he'd sat transfixed as a child, showed its age. Equipment dated to the 1960s. Exhibits explained astronomy using outdated photographs and hand-painted displays. The building had served generations well, but astronomy had advanced dramatically in 3 decades. Black holes had been discovered. The cosmic microwave background mapped. Exoplanets found orbiting distant stars. The old planetarium told stories from a previous era of understanding. The renovation offered opportunity to rebuild from foundation to dome, creating something revolutionary. But first, Neil had to decide what story the new planetarium would tell. How do you make the universe comprehensible to visitors who might know nothing about astronomy? How do you inspire 9-year-olds the way he'd been inspired? His team included architects, exhibit designers, educators, astronomers. They debated every detail: what planetarium shows to create, which exhibits would occupy the new space, how to balance education with entertainment, how to make complex astrophysics accessible without oversimplifying. Neil pushed for accuracy above all. No cartoon planets with smiling faces, no simplified models that taught incorrect concepts. If children learned astronomy here, they'd learn it right, even if that meant grappling with challenging ideas. 9-year-old Neil had been capable of understanding orbital mechanics and stellar evolution. Modern 9-year-olds deserved the same respect. One decision would prove particularly controversial: how to organize the solar system display. Traditional planetariums grouped planets in order from the Sun: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. 9 planets, memorized by generations through mnemonics about mothers serving nachos or pizzas. The order was familiar, comfortable, unquestioned. But Neil saw a problem. That organization was arbitrary, based purely on distance. It taught nothing about what planets actually are, how they form, why they differ. It lumped together objects with fundamentally different properties simply because they orbited the same star. He proposed something radical: group planets by physical characteristics instead. Create a family of terrestrial planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, small, rocky worlds with solid surfaces. Create another family of gas giants: Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, massive worlds without solid surfaces, composed primarily of hydrogen and helium. And then there was Pluto. Pluto didn't fit either category. Too small for a gas giant, too icy for a terrestrial planet. Its orbit was tilted and elliptical, sometimes passing inside Neptune's path. Its composition resembled comets more than planets. And most tellingly, astronomers were discovering hundreds of similar objects in the outer solar system, icy bodies that shared Pluto's characteristics. Neil made the decision. The new planetarium would present 8 planets grouped by physical properties. Pluto would be displayed separately as the largest known member of the Kuiper Belt, a region of icy bodies beyond Neptune. The choice was scientifically sound, honest, accurate to current understanding, but Neil underestimated how emotionally attached people were to Pluto's planetary status. The new planetarium opened in February 2000. The Rose Center for Earth and Space gleamed with modern architecture, dominated by an 87-foot sphere housing the Sky Theater. Exhibits explained cosmic evolution from the Big Bang through stellar formation to planetary systems. Everything was state-of-the-art, beautiful, scientifically rigorous. Then someone noticed Pluto wasn't listed among the planets. The reaction was immediate and intense. Newspapers ran headlines, "Pluto's identity crisis," and "Museum gives planet the boot." Astronomers debated whether Neil had overstepped, whether institutional authority to reclassify celestial objects resided with planetariums or scientific bodies like the International Astronomical Union. The public expressed outrage. Pluto was their planet. They'd learned 9 planets in school. You can't just eliminate one. Neil received hate mail, actual hate mail, about planetary classification. Some letters were humorous, children pleading for Pluto's reinstatement. Others were angry, accusing him of destroying tradition, of confusing students, of scientific arrogance. One writer called him the man who killed Pluto, a nickname that would stick for years. Television producers invited him to defend the decision. Neil appeared on news programs, explaining that science evolves as understanding improves. Pluto wasn't destroyed. It was still there, still fascinating, but calling it a planet while excluding hundreds of similar objects made no sense. Either you have 8 planets, or you have hundreds. The choice was arbitrary classification or physical reality. He used analogies to make the concept accessible. Is a tomato a fruit or vegetable? He'd ask. Botanically, it's a fruit. Culinarily, it's a vegetable. Both classifications are valid depending on context. Pluto is like that. It's a Kuiper Belt object, which is a more meaningful classification than calling it a planet. The controversy generated publicity far beyond typical planetarium coverage. Major newspapers profiled Neil, this young astrophysicist willing to challenge convention for scientific accuracy. His media appearances revealed something unexpected. He was remarkably good at explaining complex concepts clearly, making viewers feel engaged rather than lectured, balancing authority with approachability. Television producers noticed. Here was an astrophysicist who could actually communicate science to general audiences, who didn't hide behind jargon, who made people excited about learning. And crucially, here was a black scientist becoming a public figure in a field where black representation was nearly invisible. Meanwhile, the planetarium itself was succeeding spectacularly. Attendance increased dramatically. Families traveled from across the country to experience the new shows. Students filled the education center, participating in programs that explained everything from stellar evolution to dark matter. The gamble on reconstruction had paid off. Neil's leadership extended beyond the building. He wrote articles for popular science magazines, explaining recent discoveries in accessible language. He appeared at public lectures, filling auditoriums with people curious about black holes, the Big Bang, the search for extraterrestrial life. He became the public face of the Hayden Planetarium, and increasingly, a public face of astronomy generally. The transformation was remarkable. 5 years earlier, he'd been a graduate student known primarily within academic circles. Now he was directing a major cultural institution, appearing on national television, influencing how millions understood the cosmos. And he was doing it while visibly black. Impossible to ignore, impossible to pretend that science was exclusively a white domain. Young black students started visiting the planetarium specifically to see him. Parents brought children, pointing out that the director looked like them, that someone who shared their background had achieved this. Neil understood the significance. He'd been that 9-year-old who needed to see the universe was accessible to him. Now he could be the visible proof for others. But with visibility came scrutiny. Some astronomy colleagues criticized his focus on public engagement over research publication. The traditional academic path emphasized peer-reviewed papers, conference presentations, grants, and citations. Neil was doing something different, prioritizing public understanding over academic productivity. He defended his choice pragmatically. More people will learn astrophysics from one planetarium show than from 100 research papers, he'd say. Both are important, but if we want public support for science, scientists need to engage the public. The Pluto controversy refused to die. Years after the planetarium's opening, the International Astronomical Union formally addressed the planet definition question. In 2006, they voted to create an official definition that required planets to have cleared their orbital neighborhood of other objects. Pluto, sharing its region with thousands of similar bodies, didn't qualify. The decision validated Neil's choice from 6 years earlier. He hadn't killed Pluto. He'd simply recognized reality before official bodies caught up. But the nickname stuck. He was the Pluto killer, embraced with humor and occasional exasperation. Children sent him drawings of Pluto crying, begging for planetary status. Neil responded to many personally, explaining that Pluto was actually more interesting as a Kuiper Belt object than as the smallest, oddest planet. We didn't demote Pluto, he'd write. We promoted it to King of the Kuiper Belt. The hate mail gradually mixed with fan mail. People thanked him for making science accessible, for appearing on television and explaining complex topics clearly, for showing that astrophysicists were real people with senses of humor, not distant academics in ivory towers. Television appearances multiplied. Neil became a regular guest on news programs when astronomical events occurred, explaining eclipses, meteor showers, planetary alignments. He appeared on talk shows, where hosts were surprised and delighted that discussing astrophysics could be entertaining. He had a gift for finding everyday analogies that made cosmic phenomena comprehensible. When explaining black holes, imagine space-time as a trampoline. Put a bowling ball on it, and it creates a depression. That's how mass curves space. Now imagine a ball so heavy the trampoline rips. That's a black hole. When explaining the universe's expansion, raisins in rising bread dough move apart as the dough expands. Galaxies do the same as space itself expands between them. They're not moving through space, space is expanding. These explanations worked because they connected unfamiliar concepts to familiar experiences. Neil was translating astrophysics into common language without losing accuracy, making the universe accessible to millions who'd never taken an astronomy course. The planetarium continued, evolving under his direction. New shows premiered regularly, incorporating latest discoveries. When images from the Hubble Space Telescope revealed distant galaxies, the planetarium featured them within months. When the Mars rovers sent back photographs, visitors could see them projected on the Sky Theatre dome. The facility became a bridge between active research and public understanding. Neil hired diverse staff, ensuring the planetarium reflected the city it served. He created programs specifically targeting underserved communities, bringing astronomy to schools that lacked resources for field trips. If students couldn't come to the planetarium would come to them through mobile programs and online content. His visibility made him a target for different criticism. Some people questioned whether he'd earned his position or benefited from affirmative action. The old assumptions followed him from Harvard and Princeton. Never mind his doctorate from Princeton, his research publications, his demonstrable success as director. Some observers needed to believe his achievements required explanation beyond talent and effort. Neil addressed these assumptions directly when asked. "I'm good at what I do," he'd say simply. The planetarium's success demonstrates that. If you need to believe something else, that reveals more about your assumptions than my capabilities. The directness was refreshing. No defensive explanations, no elaborate justifications. Just confident acknowledgement of achievement earned through work. This confidence was important for young people watching, learning that you don't owe explanations to those determined to doubt you. By 2005, Neil had transformed the Hayden Planetarium into one of the world's premier astronomy institutions. Attendance exceeded projections. Education programs reached thousands of students annually. The facility generated revenue through ticket sales and donations, proving that high-quality science education could be financially sustainable. More importantly, he demonstrated that planetariums could be relevant in the Internet age. Some critics had suggested that with astronomy information readily available online, physical institutions were obsolete. Neil proved them wrong by creating experiences that couldn't be replicated on screens: the immersive dome shows, the hands-on exhibits, the sense of wonder that comes from experiencing cosmic scale in person. But Neil was thinking bigger. The planetarium was reaching hundreds of thousands annually. Television could reach millions. He'd been appearing on various programs, gaining experience, learning what worked in different formats. Now producers were approaching him with larger opportunities. One call would change everything. Would he be interested in hosting his own science series? The universe that claimed him in this building at age 9 had led him back here at 37. Now, at 47, it was preparing to send him out again, to carry that wonder to audiences beyond anything he'd imagined possible. The boy with the telescope who'd claimed stars from a Bronx rooftop was about to claim millions of viewers, making the cosmos accessible to anyone willing to look up. The television series Nova Science Now premiered in 2005 with Neil as host. Suddenly, his reach expanded from hundreds of thousands of planetarium visitors annually to 10 million viewers per episode. 10 million people watching an astrophysicist explain black holes, dark matter, string theory, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. This was unprecedented territory. Science programming typically occupied educational television slots, watched by dedicated audiences already interested in the subject. Nova Science Now aimed for something different, making cutting-edge science compelling enough for casual viewers, people who might accidentally discover astrophysics while channel surfing. Neil's hosting style made it work. He didn't lecture from behind a desk. He went places, did things, engaged directly with scientists making discoveries. When explaining particle physics, he visited the Large Hadron Collider, walked through the tunnels, showed the enormous scale of equipment required to smash atoms together. When discussing marine biology, he dove with researchers studying deep-sea creatures. When exploring neuroscience, he had his own brain scanned, sharing the images with viewers. The approach was revolutionary. Make the host part of the discovery process rather than a distant narrator. Let viewers feel like they're investigating alongside you, experiencing the same wonder and curiosity. Neil wasn't telling people about science. He was inviting them to explore it with him. His explanations used everyday analogies that made complex concepts accessible. Dark matter became the invisible scaffolding holding galaxies together, like the metal frame inside a building that you can't see but knows is there because the structure stands. Quantum entanglement became a pair of magic coins that always land opposite when flipped, no matter how far apart. The Big Bang became not an explosion in space, but the expansion of space itself, like dots drawn on a balloon that separate as the balloon inflates. These analogies weren't perfect. No analogy perfectly captures quantum mechanics or relativistic spacetime. But they gave viewers conceptual footholds, ways to begin understanding phenomena that initially seemed incomprehensible. Television revealed something else about Neil. He was genuinely funny. Not trying too hard to be entertaining, funny, but naturally witty, willing to laugh at himself, comfortable with humor as a teaching tool. When explaining how astronomers measure cosmic distances, he'd joke about the universe being bigger than you think, then bigger than that, then bigger still, until your brain hurts. When discussing the sun's eventual death, he'd reassure viewers, "Good news, we have 5 billion years. Bad news, mark your calendars." The humor made astrophysics less intimidating. Science wasn't a solemn cathedral where jokes were forbidden. It was a human endeavor, pursued by people who could laugh while contemplating infinity. Nova Science Now covered diverse topics: climate change, infectious disease, technology, evolution. Neil interviewed scientists across disciplines, demonstrating that curiosity about the natural world didn't require specializing in one narrow field. The universe includes everything, and understanding any part requires appreciating how systems connect. Viewer response exceeded expectations. Ratings climbed. Fan mail arrived praising Neil's clear explanations, thanking him for making science accessible. Teachers reported using episodes in classrooms, students engaged by Neil's presentation style. The series won Emmy nominations, critical acclaim, and most importantly, reached audiences who'd never considered watching science programming before. But something else was happening simultaneously, something more profound than ratings and awards. Black children were seeing themselves represented in science. Parents wrote letters describing their kids' reactions. "My daughter said she wants to be an astrophysicist like Dr. Tyson. My son asked for a telescope after watching your show. You're the first scientist my children have seen who looks like them." Neil read these letters with deep emotion. He remembered being that child, searching for examples, needing to know that someone who looked like him could study the stars. Now he was becoming that example for a generation. Visible proof that astrophysics welcomed everyone. The visibility brought responsibility. Neil couldn't just be good at his job. He had to be exceptional, knowing that some viewers were watching skeptically, waiting for him to confirm their prejudices about black intellectual capability. Every mispronounced word, every simplified explanation, every moment of hesitation could be weaponized by those seeking to prove scientists should look different. This pressure was exhausting, unfair, and undeniable. But Neil handled it the way he'd handled similar pressure at Harvard and Princeton, by being so thoroughly prepared, so clearly knowledgeable, so demonstrably excellent that criticism found no purchase. Then came an opportunity that eclipsed everything previous: hosting a reboot of Cosmos. Carl Sagan's original Cosmos series, which aired in 1980, had been revolutionary. Over 13 episodes, Sagan had explained the universe's history, humanity's place in it, the scientific method's power, and the fragility of Earth. 750 million people across 60 countries watched. It became the most viewed science program in television history, inspiring countless people to pursue science careers. Sagan died in 1996, the same year Neil became planetarium director. 4 years. Discussions percolated about reviving Cosmos for a new generation. The original series was dated now, missing 3 decades of discoveries: dark energy, exoplanets, the accelerating universe expansion, detailed images from Mars rovers and Hubble. Multiple people were considered to host the new series. It had to be someone with scientific credibility, communication skills, and the charisma to hold audiences through 13 hours of complex material. It had to be someone who could honor Sagan's legacy while creating their own path. Neil received the call in 2011. Would he host Cosmos, a space-time odyssey? The weight of that invitation was staggering. Sagan was a legend, beloved, irreplaceable. Following him meant inevitable comparison, criticism that he wasn't Sagan, couldn't match Sagan's poetic eloquence or gentle demeanor. It meant stepping into enormous visibility, becoming the face of science education for potentially hundreds of millions of people, globally. Neil accepted. Production took 3 years. The series had a substantial budget, allowing spectacular graphics that depicted cosmic events with cinematic quality. Neil traveled to locations worldwide, filming segments at the Grand Canyon, on ships at sea, in deserts and forests and cities. The series would cover the universe's complete history, from the Big Bang through stellar evolution to the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Neil brought his own sensibility to the material. Where Sagan had been gentle and poetic, Neil was energetic and direct. Where Sagan spoke softly, Neil gestured broadly. Both styles worked because both were authentic, reflecting the hosts' genuine personalities rather than manufactured television personas. Cosmos, a space-time odyssey, premiered in March 2014, simultaneously on multiple networks, an unprecedented broadcast strategy. The first episode reached 40 million viewers globally, more people experiencing astrophysics education in 1 hour than most scientists reach in entire careers. The series was stunning. Graphics showed galaxies colliding in slow motion, stars exploding into supernovae, black holes warping space-time visibly. Neil guided viewers through cosmic evolution, explaining how we're literally made of stardust, how the carbon and oxygen and nitrogen composing our bodies formed inside ancient stars that exploded billions of years ago. "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself," he said, echoing Sagan's famous line but in his own voice, with his own inflection. Not copying his predecessor but continuing the conversation. The series addressed controversial topics without apology. Climate change was presented as scientific consensus, not debatable opinion. Evolution was explained as established fact, supported by overwhelming evidence. Neil didn't hedge or pretend false balance existed where evidence was one-sided. Science isn't democracy. Reality doesn't care about votes. This directness attracted both praise and criticism. Those who valued scientific accuracy celebrated the series' integrity. Those who preferred their beliefs, unchallenged by evidence, criticized Neil for arrogance, for dismissing alternative viewpoints. He responded by pointing out that science welcomes challenges when supported by evidence and testable predictions. Religious dogma or political preference don't constitute scientific alternatives. The series won 4 Emmy Awards and a Peabody Award. More importantly, it reached audiences worldwide, translated into dozens of languages, watched by people who'd never considered their connection to the cosmos. Teachers incorporated episodes into curricula. Libraries reported increased checkout of astronomy books. Planetariums saw attendance spikes. Neil was now indisputably the world's most visible scientist. His face appeared on magazine covers. Interview requests flooded in from media worldwide. He'd achieved something remarkable. Made astrophysics part of mainstream culture. Made it acceptable, even cool, to care about science. But Neil wasn't satisfied with traditional media alone. He launched a podcast called Star Talk, blending science with popular culture. Guests included scientists, yes, but also comedians, actors, musicians, athletes. The format was intentionally casual, conversations rather than interviews, jokes mixed with explanations, science demonstrated as relevant to everything. He interviewed Whoopi Goldberg about whether Star Trek's physics made sense. He talked with Elon Musk about Mars colonization's challenges. He discussed black holes with Christopher Nolan when Interstellar premiered. The message was clear. Science isn't separate from culture. It's part of culture, relevant to every conversation, connected to every aspect of human experience. Star Talk's audience grew rapidly. Millions downloaded episodes, listening while commuting, exercising, cooking dinner. Neil had discovered another medium for reaching people, more intimate than television, more conversational than lectures. The podcast format allowed longer discussions, deeper exploration of topics, the kind of nuanced conversation television's time constraints often prevented. Social media expanded his reach further. Neil joined Twitter, where his account rapidly accumulated millions of followers. He posted daily, sharing cosmic perspective on current events, explaining astronomical phenomena, occasionally stirring controversy with provocative observations. When people celebrated New Year's Eve, he'd tweet, "The universe doesn't care about your calendar. Earth has completed another orbit around the sun. That's the only significance." Some found this refreshing honesty. Others considered it killjoy behavior. Neil didn't apologize. Science tells truth, sometimes uncomfortable truth. His Twitter presence made him accessible in unprecedented ways. Anyone could interact with one of the world's leading astrophysicists, ask questions, receive responses. Democratization of scientific knowledge, made possible by technology Carl Sagan never had access to. The visibility created feedback loops. Media appearances led to more opportunities, which generated more visibility, which created more invitations. Neil appeared on The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, Real Time with Bill Maher, late-night talk shows. Each appearance reached new audiences, introduced astrophysics to people who'd never seek it out deliberately. This was the multiplication effect of public science communication. One person explaining the cosmos to millions becomes millions, potentially explaining it to others, the knowledge spreading exponentially. Neil wasn't just teaching science. He was creating conditions where science could propagate through culture organically. Young black students continued benefiting most dramatically from his visibility. Astronomy departments reported increased applications from black students, citing Neil as inspiration. Academic programs created scholarships in his name. He'd become what he'd needed as a child, proof that someone who looked like him could claim the universe. But Neil remained aware of how precarious this representation was. He was often the only black scientist in media spaces, carrying representative burden. When he made mistakes or expressed controversial opinions, critics used them to question whether black scientists generally deserved platforms. His individual humanity got lost in symbolic significance. This was exhausting in ways that white scientists never experienced. They could be individuals, their mistakes reflecting only on themselves. Neil's mistakes supposedly reflected on every black scientist, every underrepresented person trying to enter STEM fields. He navigated this carefully but imperfectly, sometimes defensive, sometimes eloquent, always aware the stakes extended beyond his personal reputation. Every time he explained astrophysics, clearly, he was fighting decades of stereotypes about black intellectual capability. Every time he demonstrated expertise, he was proving something that shouldn't require proof. The cosmic ambassador role that had found him through television, podcasts, social media, was transforming how millions understood both science and who could be scientists. The boy with the telescope was now the man with the megaphone, broadcasting cosmic wonder to anyone willing to listen. By 2020, Neil deGrasse Tyson had become something unprecedented in American culture, a scientist whose name recognition rivaled movie stars and athletes. 3 million people followed his Twitter account, receiving daily doses of cosmic perspective. When he appeared on television, millions watched. When he spoke at universities, Auditoriums overflowed with students eager to hear an astrophysicist explain black holes and multiverses. This visibility translated into measurable impact across multiple dimensions. Numbers tell part of the story, though numbers alone can't capture everything that matters. Astronomy departments at universities across America reported a dramatic shift in applicants, 30% increases in black students applying to doctoral programs, many citing Neil specifically as inspiration. These weren't abstract statistics. These were real people, young women from Atlanta, young men from Chicago, students from communities where pursuing astrophysics had seemed impossible, now imagining themselves as scientists because they'd seen someone who looked like them succeed. Program directors noticed the change immediately. Applications they might have received 5 or 10 years ago weren't arriving anymore because potential applicants hadn't imagined themselves as astrophysicists. Now those applications flooded in, from talented students who'd always loved space but hadn't believed that love could become a career. Young girls, particularly black girls, named Neil as their inspiration for pursuing physics. Teachers reported conversations where students said explicitly, "I want to be like Dr. Tyson." This was revolutionary. Physics remains one of the least diverse scientific fields, with women and minorities severely underrepresented. Every student Neil inspired to pursue it represented a crack in those barriers. Consider what this means generationally. Each of these students, if they complete doctoral programs and become researchers, will supervise their own students, creating cascading effects. Representation multiplies. One visible scientist creates conditions for hundreds more, who create conditions for thousands. The mathematics of inspiration work exponentially. But Neil's impact extended beyond academia. His television appearances reached people who'd never attend university, who'd never take physics courses, but who deserved cosmic perspective nonetheless. When he explained on late-night television that we're all made of stardust, that the atoms composing our bodies formed inside ancient stars, viewers experienced a shift in how they understood their place in the universe. This wasn't trivial. When people grasp that they're literally connected to cosmic evolution, that they're not separate from the universe but part of it, something changes. The perspective makes earthly conflicts seem smaller, makes environmental protection seem urgent, makes the preciousness of life more apparent. Neil used this cosmic perspective deliberately during crises. When political conflicts dominated news cycles, he'd tweet reminders about Earth's fragility. We are one species on a tiny planet orbiting an ordinary star in an average galaxy among billions. Perhaps we should work together. Some criticized this as naive or dismissive of real problems, but others found it clarifying, a reminder that cooperation benefits everyone when you're all passengers on the same planetary spaceship. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Neil became an important voice for scientific literacy. As misinformation spread about vaccines and disease transmission, he explained patiently how vaccines work, how we know they're safe, why trusting scientific consensus makes sense. He didn't mock people who were confused or skeptical. He met them where they were, acknowledging that science can seem complicated, that not everyone has training to evaluate evidence directly. This patience was crucial. Science communication often fails because scientists treat public ignorance with condescension. Neil understood that people aren't stupid for not knowing things they were never taught. They just need clear explanations from someone willing to teach without judgment. He battled flat Earth conspiracies with humor rather than anger. When flat earthers claimed NASA faked space photographs, Neil would respond, "Humanity has known Earth is spherical for 2,000 years. Every ship that sailed over the horizon, every satellite in orbit, every physics equation that describes planetary motion, all confirm this. Denying Earth's shape requires denying all of physics." Then he'd offer to explain how we know, patiently working through evidence. Some critics argued he wasted time engaging with conspiracy theorists, that their beliefs were impervious to evidence. Neil disagreed. He wasn't trying to convince the hardcore believers. He was providing clear explanations for the undecided, the people exposed to misinformation but not yet committed to it. Those people were reachable through patient, clear, respectful education. The anti-vaccine movement received similar treatment. Neil explained how vaccines work at the molecular level, how clinical trials determine safety, why the risks of diseases far exceed the minimal risks of vaccination. He acknowledged that pharmaceutical companies have made mistakes historically, that skepticism of powerful institutions makes sense. But then he showed why scientific consensus about vaccines reflects overwhelming evidence, not conspiracy. This careful balance, acknowledging legitimate concerns while standing firm on scientific facts, made his message effective. People who might dismiss a condescending lecture listened to someone who treated their questions seriously. Neil's influence extended into politics, though he resisted being labeled a political figure. When politicians denied climate change or dismissed evolution, he called them out directly, not as a Democrat or Republican, but as someone who understood that scientific reality doesn't care about political affiliation. Physics works the same way regardless of who's president. This stance frustrated both political tribes. Conservatives wanted him to soften criticism of climate change denial. Progressives wanted him to explicitly endorse their candidates. Neil refused both requests. Science isn't liberal or conservative. It's just what the evidence shows. Politicians who ignore evidence from any party deserved criticism. He testified before Congress multiple times, advocating for science funding, explaining why basic research matters even when practical applications aren't immediately obvious. You can't predict where breakthroughs come from, he'd tell legislators. Einstein's work on relativity seemed useless in 1905. Now it's essential for GPS satellites. Fund curiosity-driven research, and breakthroughs emerge. Some representatives listened. Others continued treating science funding as expendable, something to cut when budgets needed balancing. Neil persisted anyway, returning to make the case repeatedly, understanding that cultural change happens slowly through sustained effort. His books reached millions more people. Astrophysics for People in a Hurry became a bestseller, explaining cosmic evolution in accessible prose. Death by Black Hole collected essays on various astronomical phenomena. Letters from an Astrophysicist compiled his responses to readers asking everything from whether God exists to why Pluto got demoted. Each book extended his reach beyond television and social media, allowing deeper exploration of topics than tweets or brief interviews permitted. The books revealed Neil's writing style: clear, occasionally funny, respectful of readers' intelligence. He didn't oversimplify to the point of error, but he also didn't hide behind jargon when plain language worked. This balance made astrophysics accessible without being condescending. Teachers incorporated his books into science curricula. Students read them for personal interest. Parents bought them hoping to understand their children's enthusiasm for astronomy. The books became bridges between professional astrophysics and general curiosity about the universe. Neil's speaking engagements filled venues regardless of location. Universities paid substantial fees to have him speak, knowing his presence would attract students, generate publicity, inspire potential science majors. Corporate conferences invited him to provide cosmic perspective on business challenges. He'd explain how the universe's immense age made quarterly earnings reports seem trivially short-term, how cosmic interconnection suggested cooperation beats competition long-term. These speaking fees generated criticism. Some argued he'd become a celebrity rather than a scientist, that he'd abandoned research for profit. Neil responded practically. The fees funded his other work, allowed him to choose which projects to pursue, gave him independence that pure academic employment wouldn't provide. and more people learned astrophysics from one of his talks than would read a dozen research papers. The criticism reflected tension within science about public engagement. Traditional academic culture values research publication above all else. Public communication historically received little credit, sometimes viewed as distraction from serious work. Neil represented a different model. Scientist as public educator, using media reach to advance scientific literacy broadly, rather than advancing one specialized research area incrementally. Both approaches have value. Science needs researchers pushing boundaries of knowledge. It also needs communicators making that knowledge accessible. Neil had chosen the second path consciously, understanding that his particular talents explaining complex topics clearly, engaging diverse audiences, using humor to make science approachable, could serve science differently than another research paper on galactic bulges. The impact showed in cultural shifts. Science became more visible in mainstream media. Other scientists received opportunities to host programs, write books, engage publicly, because Neil had demonstrated demand existed. He'd opened doors that benefited the entire scientific community. Young scientists, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, benefited most. When Neil appeared on television, producers realized audiences would watch black scientists. When his books became bestsellers, publishers sought other diverse voices in science. When his speaking engagements filled auditoriums, event organizers realized scientists from various backgrounds drew crowds. This wasn't charity or tokenism. It was recognition that talent exists everywhere, that restricting science's public face to one demographic meant missing remarkable communicators who happened to look different. Neil mentored younger scientists directly, too. He received countless emails from aspiring astrophysicists seeking advice. He couldn't respond to all the volume was impossible, but he answered many, offering guidance on graduate programs, research directions, navigating academia's challenges. Several scientists who'd received early career advice from Neil now led their own research teams, publishing important work, mentoring their own students. The multiplication effect again. One person helping dozens who help hundreds, who help thousands. Impact that compounds across time, impossible to fully measure, but undeniably real. Prison education programs reported something unexpected. Inmates reading Neil's books, watching his interviews online, becoming interested in science despite challenging circumstances. Several wrote letters describing how cosmic perspective helped them, understanding that they're made of stardust, that they're connected to the universe's grand history, gave them dignity that prison systems tried to strip away. Some pursued science education after release, inspired by Neil's message that the universe welcomes all who seek to understand it. These stories might seem small compared to Neil's major accomplishments, but they reveal how scientific literacy can transform individual lives, how understanding our place in the cosmos provides meaning and hope even in difficult circumstances. Neil used his platform to address systemic issues in science. He spoke openly about the obstacles he'd faced, the assumptions about his capability, the isolation of being one of few black astrophysicists. This honesty mattered because it validated others' experiences, showed them that success was possible despite barriers, made clear that those barriers needed dismantling. He advocated for changing how science evaluates talent. Stop assuming only certain demographics can excel. Stop mistaking preparation for ability. Stop conflating confidence with competence. Start recognizing that genius appears in every community, that failure to find diverse talent reflects flawed search methods, not limited supply. These arguments made some scientists uncomfortable. They preferred believing that science was already meritocratic, that the best people naturally rose to the top. Neil's existence, his success, despite facing obstacles that shouldn't exist, proved that comfortable belief wrong. The cosmic perspective he offered extended beyond astrophysics to environmental issues. When he explained that Earth is the only known planet harboring life, that we have no backup world, that our atmosphere and climate exist in delicate balance, listeners understood the stakes of environmental protection differently. This wasn't political ideology. This was physical reality, as certain as gravity. Climate change deniers challenged him regularly. Neil responded with evidence: rising temperatures measured globally, ice cores showing atmospheric composition changes, sea levels rising measurably, countless data points, all pointing the same direction. Science isn't about opinion, it's about what the measurements show. His willingness to engage difficult topics, to speak clearly about politically contentious issues, made him controversial, but it also made him effective. Millions of people trusted his explanations because he demonstrated expertise, because he communicated clearly, because he didn't hide behind diplomatic hedging when evidence was clear. As 2025 approached, Neil remained perhaps the world's most recognizable scientist. His influence touched education, media, public policy, individual lives. The numbers: 3 million Twitter followers, millions of book sales, countless speaking engagements measured part of the impact. But the immeasurable parts mattered too. The child who looked up at stars and thought, maybe I could study those. The teacher who found better ways to explain astrophysics. The person who gained cosmic perspective during difficult times. The boy from the Bronx with a 60mm telescope had become a force in motion, pushing science forward through public engagement, opening doors for those who followed, proving that the universe truly belongs to everyone willing to look up. The trajectory is clear now, written across decades like the path of a comet arcing through space. What began on October 9th, 1968, in a darkened planetarium, has become something larger than one person's career. It has become a demonstration of what's possible when barriers fall, when talent receives opportunity, when one person's success creates pathways for thousands more. Neil established the Neil deGrasse Tyson Scholarship at the Bronx High School of Science, funding students who share his passion for astronomy but lack resources to pursue it. The scholarship pays for telescopes, books, summer programs, college application fees, all the small costs that accumulate into insurmountable barriers for families without means. Each year, several students receive this support, removing obstacles that might otherwise end their astronomical ambitions before they truly begin. These scholarship recipients represent Neil's investment in future generations. He remembers being the student who needed his mother to save for months to buy a telescope. Now he ensures other students don't face that same struggle. Money shouldn't determine who studies the stars. Several scholarship recipients have already completed undergraduate degrees in physics and astronomy. Some are pursuing doctorates now, conducting their own research, building careers. In a few years, they'll supervise their own students, extending the chain of mentorship forward. Neil's influence will ripple through generations he'll never meet, through discoveries he'll never personally make. The mentorship extends beyond formal scholarships. Neil maintains contact with dozens of young scientists, offering advice when asked, writing recommendation letters, making connections that help launch careers. He remembers Professor de Vaucouleurs seeing his potential when others saw only his difference. Now he provides that same recognition to others navigating similar obstacles. Several of these mentored scientists now lead research teams at major universities. They're publishing important work on exoplanets, galaxy evolution, cosmology. They're teaching their own students, several of whom are from underrepresented backgrounds, continuing the cycle. This multiplication effect, one mentor enabling 10, who enable 100, represents Neil's most enduring contribution. The cultural shift he catalyzed is perhaps most remarkable. Before Neil's rise to prominence, most Americans couldn't name a contemporary astrophysicist. Science seemed distant, performed by faceless researchers in laboratories, irrelevant to daily life. Neil changed that perception through personality and accessibility, showing that scientists are real people with humor and enthusiasm, that science connects to everything we experience. More importantly, he changed who children imagine when they picture a scientist. A generation is growing up having always known a black astrophysicist as the most famous scientist in America. They don't see his race as exceptional or surprising. They see it as normal, as proof that science welcomes everyone. This normalization matters profoundly when representation becomes unremarkable, when diversity is simply expected rather than celebrated as unusual. Systemic change has occurred. Neil's visibility has helped create conditions where the next generation won't find his success surprising, because they'll see scientists from all backgrounds regularly. Teachers report transformations in their classrooms. Students who previously showed no interest in science become engaged after watching Neil's programs or reading his books. The cosmic perspective he offers, "We're all made of stardust, all connected to the universe's history," resonates with young people searching for meaning and connection. One teacher in Harlem wrote, describing a student who'd been failing, disengaged, seemingly unreachable. Then the student saw Neil on television, explaining black holes with infectious enthusiasm. The next day, the student asked the teacher about astrophysics, started doing homework, brought in questions about space, eventually graduated and enrolled in community college, taking physics courses, dreaming of transferring to a 4-year program. That single story matters, but it's not singular. Variations repeat across the country. The girl in rural Mississippi who bought her first telescope after reading Neil's book, the boy in Los Angeles who joined his school's science club after watching Cosmos, the teenager in Detroit who changed college plans from business to physics after attending one of Neil's lectures. These individual transformations aggregate into cultural change. More students pursuing science means more innovation, more discovery, more solutions to challenges facing humanity. Neil's influence extends far beyond his own research into all the research his inspiration enables. The prison education story from the previous chapter exemplifies something crucial. Knowledge provides dignity. The former gang member who discovered astrophysics while incarcerated, who read Neil's books in his cell, who began understanding the universe's scale and his connection to it, he became an engineer after release, built a successful career, mentored other young men from his neighborhood, showing them alternatives to the paths that had trapped him. That's one life redirected toward contribution rather than destruction. But through his own mentoring, that one life multiplies into dozens more. The mathematics of changed trajectories compound exponentially across time. Neil knows his impact is incomplete. For all his success, astrophysics remains overwhelmingly white and male. Women and minorities still face obstacles he faced decades ago. Progress has occurred, yes, but true equity remains distant. He uses his platform to acknowledge this honestly, to keep pushing for systemic change rather than declaring victory prematurely. He also knows his success, while remarkable, shouldn't be necessary as proof. The fact that one person had to overcome so many obstacles to become an astrophysicist demonstrates how many potential scientists we lose to unnecessary barriers. For every Neil deGrasse Tyson who persists, how many equally talented people abandon science because the obstacles prove insurmountable? This question motivates his continued advocacy, not just celebrating his own achievement, but working to ensure the next generation faces fewer obstacles. That talent in any community receives development rather than dismissal. The seeds he has planted are beginning to bloom visibly. Astronomy departments report increasing diversity. Science media features more varied voices. Planetariums across America have become more accessible, reaching underserved communities deliberately rather than accidentally. These changes reflect many people's efforts, certainly, but Neil's visibility and advocacy accelerated shifts that might have taken decades more. Tomorrow's sky will reveal stars to eyes that couldn't have seen them clearly a generation ago. Not because the stars changed. They're the same ones humans have observed for millennia, but because barriers that blocked certain communities from astronomy have begun crumbling. The universe has always belonged to everyone. Now, more people can claim that inheritance. Consider the girl in Harlem who bought her first telescope after seeing Neil speak. She's now an undergraduate studying astrophysics at Columbia University. She leads outreach programs, bringing astronomy to New York City public schools. She mentors younger students, particularly girls of color, showing them that their dreams of studying space are valid and achievable. In a few years, she'll likely pursue a doctorate, might become a professor, will certainly inspire her own cohort of students. The chain continues, each link enabling the next, the pattern replicating forward through time. Or consider the countless children who now understand that they're made of stardust, that the atoms composing their bodies formed inside ancient stars. This knowledge changes how they see themselves not as separate from the universe, but as integral parts of it, connected across cosmic scales to everything that exists. When you grasp that profound connection, when you understand that the same physics governing distant galaxies governs your heartbeat, perspective shifts. Problems seem different. Possibilities expand. The universe stops being something distant and becomes something you inhabit and participate in. Neil's mission was never just teaching astrophysics. It was providing that cosmic perspective, that sense of wonder and connection that transforms how people engage with existence. He succeeded spectacularly, reaching hundreds of millions with that message, planting seeds that will bloom long after his voice falls silent. The boy who claimed stars from a Bronx rooftop has ensured that rooftops everywhere now host dreamers who know those stars are meant for them. The child who needed to see someone who looked like him, studying the cosmos, has become that example for millions more children. The obstacles he overcame, while they shouldn't have existed, proved that barriers can be breached, that determination combined with talent can rewrite who belongs in science. The universe that claimed Neil deGrasse Tyson on October 9th, 1968, released its claim into the world, and he used it to claim the universe for everyone else. That exchange, one person's passion transforming into millions' possibilities, represents the highest form of success science can achieve. The stars that waited for him above the Bronx's light pollution now wait for everyone. The cosmos he spent decades making accessible remains accessible, invitation extended, wonder available to anyone willing to look up. And looking up, more people than ever see not just distant lights but connections, meanings, possibilities. Tomorrow's discoveries will come from minds Neil helped inspire. Tomorrow's astrophysicists will include many who wouldn't have pursued science without his example. Tomorrow's understanding of the universe will build on foundations he helped lay by making cosmic perspective available to all. The trajectory continues. The seeds have taken root, and the harvest, the full measure of what Neil deGrasse Tyson set in motion, will feed humanity's cosmic understanding for generations we cannot yet imagine. The stars shine for everyone now. He made certain of that.